captured, humiliated, and forced to surrender. The fate of King John of France was sealed by a brilliant strategy, led by a 26-year-old prince who had already tasted victory at 16. But how could a small English army defeat the most powerful in France? What went wrong, and who was behind the fall of the French king? By the mid-1300s, the Hundred Years' War had already brought chaos to France. The English had shocked the world with victories like the Battle of Poitiers. But despite those triumphs, France remained unbroken. The war was far from over. Here's Edward of Woodstock, known to history as the Black Prince, though the nickname likely came later, perhaps from his dark armor or darker reputation. In 1355, Edward, Prince of Wales and heir to the English throne, was a young man of 25, already hardened by war. He'd earned his spurs at Crécy a decade earlier, where English longbows and disciplined tactics humiliated the French nobility. Now, King Edward III, his father, tasked him with a bold mission: take the fight to France, disrupt the enemy, and remind them who held the sharper blade. In the summer of 1355, the Black Prince landed in Bordeaux, the heart of English-held Gascony in southwest France. His mission was simple but brutal: launch a chevauchée, a mounted raid designed to ravage the French countryside, loot its wealth, and undermine the authority of the French king, John II. Think of it as economic warfare with a side order of terror. The English didn't aim to hold land, they aimed to burn it, leave the peasantry starving and the nobility humiliated. That autumn, Edward's troops tore through the countryside. His army, some 6,000 to 8,000 men, moved like a swarm of locusts, leaving a trail of smouldering ruin. The French, under the Count of Armagnac, avoided open battle and watched helplessly as their lands burned. Now, you're probably wondering why the French didn't do anything about this. Well, by this time, the country was a mess. France, in the mid-14th century, was a land of immense potential, rich in farmland, population, and prestige. But it was bleeding. The Black Death had swept through a decade earlier, wiping out perhaps a third of the population. Villages stood half empty, fields lay fallow, and the labour shortage sent wages spiralling. Nobles, desperate to maintain their lavish lifestyles, squeezed their tenants harder, which only fueled resentment. Trade faltered as merchants avoided plague-ridden towns, and the royal treasury was a hollow shell, drained by years of war with England. The English, with their longbows and cheeky claims to the French throne, had already humiliated France at Crécy, exposing the vulnerability of the French knightly class. And then along comes John II, crowned in 1350 after his father, Philip VI, died. John, later dubbed the Good, was a man of chivalric ideals, brave, pious, and devoted to the idea of kingship. But ideals don't pay armies or mend alliances. He inherited a crown that was more of a burden than a prize. His court was a nest of vipers, with nobles scheming for power and influence. The most dangerous of these was Charles of Navarre, a young, slippery character with a claim to the French throne almost as good as John's. Charles, nicknamed the Bad for reasons that will soon be clear, controlled lands in Normandy and had a knack for stirring trouble. By 1354, he was openly plotting against John, cozying up to the English and even flirting with treason. Why? Because John's favoritism towards his own cronies alienated powerful lords like Charles, who felt entitled to more land, more titles, more everything. This brings us to the heart of France's division, the nobility. They were a ragtag collection of dukes, princes, and barons. each with their own armies, castles, and agendas. In theory, they owed allegiance to the king. In practice, however, they acted like petty kings themselves. Normandy, Brittany, and Gascony were hotbeds of dissent, with lords hedging their bets between John, the English, or even Charles of Navarre. The war with England gave these nobles an excuse to flex their independence. Edward's raid was so successful that in the following year, he decided to do it again. I mean, who was going to stop him? This time, he aimed north, toward the Loire Valley, to link up with another English force under the Duke of Lancaster. In July 1356, Edward set out from Bordeaux with roughly 6,000 men, knights, archers, and men-at-arms. The English swept through the countryside again, burning crops, sacking towns, and spreading panic. But John was closing in. He had raised a massive army. Estimates range from 20,000 to 50,000 men. This was no ragtag militia, but a force of French nobility, knights in gleaming armor, backed by infantry and crossbowmen. John saw a chance to trap the Black Prince and end the English threat in Aquitaine. By mid-September, Edward realized he was overextended. His scouts reported the French army approaching from the north, cutting off his path back to Bordeaux. By September 17th, the two armies were near Poitiers. Edward's men were tired and the supplies low. He chose his ground carefully, a wooded, hilly area south of Poitiers. The terrain was a natural choke point, with hedges, vineyards, and marshes that could funnel the French into a killing zone. The following day, negotiations start. John demands Edward's surrender. He tells John to get lost. And so, the Battle of Poitiers begins. John opts for a new tactic: dismounted knights. The memory of Crécy, where mounted charges were shredded by longbows, still stings. So, the French form 3 divisions, mostly on foot. The first, led by the Dauphin, Charles. The second, by the Duke of Orléans. And the third, the largest, under John himself. A small cavalry vanguard is tasked with scattering the English archers. It looks like a solid plan, but at dawn, the French vanguard charges. 300 elite knights on horseback, thundering towards the English left flank to disrupt the longbowmen. But the narrow paths and hedges slow their advance, and Edward's archers, positioned behind makeshift barriers, unleash a storm of arrows. The survivors retreat, leaving the French plan in tatters. The Dauphin's division advances, a slow, trudging mass of dismounted knights and men-at-arms. They slog through the marshy ground, shields raised. But Edward's men-at-arms repel them in brutal hand-to-hand fighting. The French falter, then retreat. The 2nd Division, under Orléans, sees the Dauphin's retreat and panics. They turn and flee without striking a blow. Now, this is very bad news for the French. John's army is now halved and have to decide whether to retreat or stand their ground. John, true to his chivalric code, decides on the latter. His division, thousands of knights, including the elite Oriflamme Guard, advances in a glittering tide, determined to break the English line. The French numerical advantage appears to pay off, until Edward plays his trump card. His entire army advances, abandoning their defensive position to meet the French head-on. At the same time, the troops of his Gascon allies appear from their hidden position, sweep around the French flanks, and charge into the rear. Even the archers decide to scavenge some weapons and get in on the action. The end comes swiftly. John fights valiantly, wielding a battle axe alongside his young son Philip. But his army disintegrates. Nobles are cut down or captured. The Oriflamme banner falls, and the French are routed. John himself is taken prisoner, along with his son and a who's who of French nobility. The Black Prince, against all odds, has turned a near disaster into a triumph.